one of our neighbors down the street has a sign, and on one half of the sign, okay, meaning not one side and the other, but it's split in two, has a message on one side and a message on the other. It says, "My body, my choice," on one side. And on the other hand, it says, "This is God's plan." Now, if I really wanted to be curious, I could go to the door and ask them about their sign. What do you mean? That first of all, what do you mean by my body, my choice? And what do you mean by that this is God's plan? Because more often than not, what someone really means by my body, my choice is that if somebody wants to kill their child, I mean purposely kill their child. We're not talking about an ectopic pregnancy. We're not talking about the application of the ethical principle of double effect. We're talking about just straight up just slaughter the kid. We're going to purposely, actively just kill it, you know. To then go on to say that that is part of God's plan has to be one of the most egregious and offensive things that could be attributed to how God has purposed nature. That we would simply halt a biological process of an actual human being, okay? Now, I've talked about this before. As Catholics, we don't have to go into biological arguments. We don't have to go into talking about issues of consciousness. All we have to do is simply appeal to our theology, which is at the moment of conception, as soon as you have a zygote, God has created anew a soul and has fused that soul and that zygote together as a single nature. It is a human being by definition. There need not be any further argumentation for it. Everything else certainly flows from that and is couched in that. But this notion that somehow we can just arbitrarily just interfere with a natural biological process towards its own health and flourishing, and that this has somehow been granted to us by God to kill children in this way is just, that's even more offensive. If I were to ask or take a poll, what is more offensive to you? The statement, "My body, more to my choice," or that this is attributed to God's plan? I would say it is even more offensive to me to say that this is part of God's plan. And I end up having to drive past this stupid sign, most days, and it just comes out of like a progressive Christianity that is not Christian. People just once again crafting things for themselves. What is that nice quote that I hear and I like? What is that? I wish I had things memorized. I might not even be able to find it. Maybe this is the quotation. It might be this. A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. That's the quote. Looks like that's attributed to John Stott. No, that's a different quotation. Who said that? I guess it doesn't matter. Richard Niebuhr, or however his name is pronounced. Yeah, so it's just this idea of a form of Christianity for oneself. It's just sad. The other thing I thought was also disturbing, there has been a kind of trend of drag queens being invited to give messages in churches. And the video that was played by Michael Knowles in his show, that was either today or yesterday, where the minister quoted the Bible verse in Romans, to not to be conformed to this world, but to be renewed but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And he used this verse to say that the drag queen exhibited what it means not to conform to the world. Now, obviously, how he was trying to use it was that he wasn't conforming to his biological role within nature and society, and that this was a good thing. But rather, the verse has nothing to do with that at all. It always just baffles me. Remember, Satan quoted scripture to Jesus. There's no shortage of ways that scripture can be twisted to mean the complete opposite of what it is attempting to portray. The term world here is simply used to speak of worldliness or carnality, sins of the flesh, perversity, which isn't diversity, it's just straight up depravity. What it means not to be conformed to this world is not to be caught up in sin. Plain and simple. Being transformed by the renewing of our mind, he tried to style as if somehow we are being changed by having all these new thoughts and this, that. That's just like, dude. The renewing of the mind, okay? The renewing of the mind, if we go back a few chapters earlier in Romans, he's talking about the carnal mind, right? The mind that's set on the flesh versus the mind that's set on the spirit. Right? The renewing of the mind is to have the mind set on the spirit, which is something very specific, very objective, and the content of which is its objective is exactly what it is. It's something that we must be formed by. So the intellect must be properly informed. The conscience must be properly formed by Catholic teaching. Right? Not by the whim of our imagination, and thereby become something else. The transformation occurs because we're actually living out the light and graces which God has given to us, and it most certainly should bring about a transformation of our life. But certainly, certainly accompanies an actual changing of the way that one thinks, but the manner in which the thoughts are changed, as well as the content that is part of that change, is incredibly vital for that verse to retain its meaning. So we can't just infuse into ourselves just anything we want. It needs to be the content of the faith. It needs to be good philosophy. It needs to be the content of the Gospels and the teaching of the church throughout the teaching of the magisterium. It can't just be anything. There's too many watered down, redefined versions of Christianity that have completely divorced themselves from history. And this is a clear example of a verse being completely divorced from the whole tenor of Scripture. I am less offended, and Michael Knowles mentioned this as well. I'm less offended by the drag queen giving the message. I'm more offended by the one I expect more from. I expect more from a person who claims to be a minister. Either way, it doesn't really care. He doesn't have valid ordination, so in a non-church, they're just playing church. I don't really care, I guess, from that standpoint, but the fact that he's trying to do what the church does, or try to do what he thinks church is, and try to play role the role of a priest and the theologian, and he's doing this, it's scandalous. It's absolutely scandalous, and it's not good. I don't know what particular denomination this happened in, but this is the kind of stuff we'll see more and more. These denominations will continue to drift further and further. And the less Catholic content they have, the faster they drift away and being caught up by the culture.